mentioned, Alchemy comes with a lot of amazing particle materials. And these particle materials, of course, can be emitter types, hair types, use objects, groups, multiple particle systems, using objects, using other materials, multiple materials, all inside of one particle material, which is super, super cool. However, the awesome thing about Alchemy is it doesn't just come with this Alchemy base pack, which is full of particle materials and also special Alchemy effect materials, but you can actually make your own particle materials and save them to whatever library you have or create. So in this video, we're going to go over the very, very basics of creating a particle material and adding it to a library. A particle system just means a lot of things. A particle can be basically anything. And then the system just refers to, okay, how are we scattering those things around? So what we're going to do to make this real clear is we're actually going to create a new library and then make a couple example particle materials. So I'm going to go ahead and close this library, and under my Alchemy options, under system here, I'm going to click new, and where it says create new library, I'm going to make a new library. Let's call it my particle library. It doesn't have to be called particle or whatever, but just for convenience sake, I'll press create and we'll see a little message there. My particle library was successfully created, and that is now the active library. And so if we were to go ahead and close this up and click library, we don't actually have any materials in this library, so we get this message, no cycles materials found. Or if we were to switch this to Blender render, we'd get a similar message, because Alchemy will of course automatically separate and display Blender render materials while in Blender render mode and cycles materials while in cycles mode. If we wanted to add just a basic material to our new library, all we would do is press new, and we've got this new material here added to this cube, and we could call it something like my fun material, and maybe give it some properties like some kind of color. Of course, we could head over to the node editor and get fancy or whatever, but you get the basic idea. It's just a material. If we want to add that material to the library, we just press this button right here, and it will be added to the active library, which happens to be my particle library. There's a total of 1 materials, 1 cycles. Okay, I'm going to close that up there. Okay, so let's make an actual particle material. I'm going to go ahead and press this to get rid of that material, which was on this cube. Press new to get a new one on here, and we'll call this my first par mat for brevity's sake. We can go ahead and give this some kind of color. Maybe we'll make this shiny, and we'll use glossy, and we'll make it have a weird color or whatever. So here's a regular material. To create a particle material, all we have to do is have a particle system on the object as the same time as the material. So if we go over to the particle tab, Blender's properties panel, and press new, hooray, we've got a particle system. And so by default, the particle system that's created when you press new to make a new particle system is type of emitter, which you can probably guess what that does. It emits things when you press play. And as you can see, it is emitting things, these little points, which unlike Blender render, when you create a new particle system in cycles, these basically are just points that represent space and there's nothing there. So if we were to say press Shift Z to do a render preview, we're not actually going to see anything show up there. To make there be things there under render, we have to select one of these things for there to be things where all the little points are. Most of these options are totally useless unless you happen to be in Blender render. The only ones you really care about when you're in cycles, when deciding what's gonna, where it's gonna be at these points, is object and group. So really the only option for an object we have here is the cube itself. And because this isn't Inception and I'm not Christopher Nolan, we're not going to have a object emitting objects that are the object, because that would be weird. Actually, I don't even know if that's possible. Let's see. No, that does not work. So we need to have a different object be what's emitted from this particle system that's on this object here. And we could create an object right here in the scene with it. So I could double right click over here in Sensei Format, or press Shift A if not in Sensei Format, and add, say, a Suzanne head. And I could press W to add some smoothing to it. We could then select this Suzanne head. Also, there's this nice little eyedropper button you can click and select things that way, which is cool. And so now if we press play, we've now made a particle system of a bunch of crazy Suzanne heads flying around. So yeah, you can have the same object in the system on the same layer, but typically that's really confusing to me. So I like to think of this layer here as sort of my backstage where I keep props and stuff like that sort of layer when I'm in Blender. So normally that's my go-to layer for putting stuff. So I'm going to select this Suzanne head, press M, and move it to that layer. And so this is sort of the backstage zone where assets and things exist. Okay, so this might be a little confusing, but when you create a new particle system, when we pressed New on the Particles tab here to create this new system, you've got this thing up here that says Particle System, and then under Settings, you have where it says Particle Settings. Now, it's important to understand that as far as blocks of data go, if that means anything to you, Blender thinks of this particle settings here, all this junk here, as the actual particle system, and this is basically just a slot holder for that thing to go. So if you want to name your particle system something, it's really best to name it where it says settings. Although you don't have to worry about that with Alchemy. If you don't bother to change this name, Alchemy will automatically give it a relevant name to say the object or whatever you're using. But we could call this monkey emitter, I suppose, if we wanted. And so if we wanted to add this particle material, it's a very odd particle material, mind you. It's just basically a blue material that shoots out monkey heads. But if we wanted to add this to our library, we just press this button here, which if you hover the mouse over, says add this material to your library. We press that, and that material is added to the library. And it's also immediately saved, so you don't have to worry about actually pressing save. Save that after you press this. Just press this and the material is good and locked in there. You'll also notice the little particle symbol that pops up, and this is because Alchemy has detected this is a particle material, and you'll always see that on your particle materials to know that it is that. So far in our little My Particle library, we have 2 materials here, and so we could close our library, open it back up. Here they are. Of course, they've now been rearranged alphabetically, and so these are good and locked in there. So if, say I were to File, Quit, and open up Blender again, and like 5 minutes later or a week later or way later, we could click on the Material tab, and when we select our library there, My Particle Library, open it up, we get this message that there's no Blender Render materials because I'm in Blender Render by default, switched it over to Cycles, and there's our materials we created. So we can use these like any other materials, of course. So I could add this to this cube here and just press use, and as soon as I do, we see down here in the camera area, which is in material viewport shading by default, that blue material and the particles added. So if I were to switch this to material viewport shading, you can see the material itself. Okay, so yeah, emitters are one type of particle system, and the other type is hair. And so hair can be like actual hair, but it can also be like grass or fur or weeds or anything you want it to be, basically. And the important part about hair type particle systems is as it doesn't throw stuff like a crazy Catwoman, which emitter types does. That's emitter type's thing, is it likes to just throw stuff all over the place. I'm going to add another object here, maybe add another monkey Suzanne head, and we'll give it a new material, and we'll call this monkey hair, I guess, because we're going to make hair. And we could change its color to a nice brownish red, whatever. Okay, so all we do to make it is we press New. This time we're going to switch this from emitter to hair. And whoa, boy howdy, the default length of hair emitter particle systems in Blender are ridiculous. So let's change that length from 4 to say 0.5. Let's see, so if we go ahead and press Shift Z, we can get to a render preview here. And so here is our basic hair emission here. And this number, of course, controls the number of actual particles, which right now is 1,000, but if we were to change it to say 5, there'd only be 5 really random stray hairs on this material, which would be pretty weird. Switch that back to 1,000. Unlike emitter type particles, when you're using a hair type particle, there is a default shape. So you don't have to actually select an object or a group to use for each point of hair here. There is a default hair internal geometry thing that Blender bothers to use. So for instance, when we clicked on render when we were using emitter type, there was a bunch of different options here, but now there's just path, object, and group. So you can still switch these pieces of hair out for objects or groups if you wanted to. So we could press Shift Z, and in my little backstage area that I like, which when we added the My First Format, the assets belonging to that particle system are automatically loaded into this second layer. However, if you don't want the particle assets to be loaded into the layer whenever you use a particle material you created, there's actually an option where you can turn that off, load particle assets into layer, you can check it off, and instead the assets will just be linked to the files. They won't show up in this little second layer here. But let's go ahead and create something for our new particle material. So maybe like this cylinder shape here, and we go into edit mode and extrude and scale and extrude and scale, just make some kind of weird thing. And we can press W to give it some smoothing. And I'm gonna extrude that bottom face down there so it doesn't look weird. Select that top face, E to extrude again, S to scale so that doesn't look weird. And we can even give the objects that our particle system use their own materials. So I could press new and call this weird thing matte, because that's what it is. And we could make it like red. And takes a second to manifest there. And I'll go ahead and rename the object I added that cylinder weird thing, like this. And back in that first layer, if we wanted to change all these pieces of hair from hair to the weird thing, we would just click on the particle tab, and instead of path, which is what it's using right now, this is just generic internal geometry path shape that Blender makes on its own, we can switch to object and select the thing we created, the weird thing. And so now in place of hair, we have that weird thing. So this looks a little more like Lego hair than it does monkey hair now. So maybe we should change this to weird Lego hair like this. And so if we wanted to then add this particle system to our library, we just press this button and it's now been added and it's there for keeps, which is nice. I should point out, of course, that your particle material, the particle bits of it won't actually be represented in the Alchemy material preview, just the material itself. But of course, you can always know what's a particle material and what's not with that sweet little sign there. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and close this library up, and let's, in our theoretical little demonstration here, let's quit and say, see a movie or something, or whatever. The point is to close Blender and we come back at some point later and we want to access that library. So we click on our material tab and click here and select the My Particle library here, which, by the way, if you want to change which library is open by default so you don't have to come in here and select the library first, all you have to do is start up a new blend file and then select the library you want to be open by default, close this up, and then go to File, Save Startup File, and then you won't have to do that if you wanted to change your default library. So just a quick tip there. But anyways, if we press library to open up our My Particle library that we built so far, there's several different ways in which we can apply these particle materials. So of course we can add it to one or multiple objects at a time. So I could add this thing and add this thing, and I could shift select all these and just press use. And of course, as soon as I do that, they start playing, so we can get immediately renderable results there. Also, if I go ahead and switch this from solid viewport shading to material, we can see the actual material was applied there. Of course, we can add any material type, including fog, fire, Alchemy effect materials, particle materials, to mesh selection. So I could say, make a torus shape here, add some smoothing to it, press tab to go into edit mode, and alt shift to do a loop selection and add to it some rings here. And I could press use. And as soon as I do, if I press tab to go back into object mode, you can already see they're manifesting around those areas where we added it. But if I went back here and press play, we can see them falling out of those specific areas that we added to that mesh selection. We can, of course, paint with our created particle materials as well. So say R2 double right click over here, add a Suzanne head, which is becoming a really overused prop for me, but it's just so convenient. And say I wanted to paint on the weird Lego hair stuff that we created a minute ago. Well, first I would need a base material for this object, which we need for any material we're going to paint. So I could just maybe add this my fun material, or I could even just create one on the fly. So we could just press new and create this generic new material here. Then select the material I want to paint with. And now if I press this button here directly, this will let me paint with the material surface as well as the particles. But if I press this button down and then press the paintbrush, this will let me paint with the particles only. So here's what it's like if we paint with the material surface and its particles. So if I press this, we're automatically switched into the mode we need to be in to begin painting. So I could, paint this very simple brown material that we made onto here. Whoops, hold shift, erase that. And to see the particles related to this, all you have to do is press this update button here, or press finish painting if you're done painting. But I'm just going to press this update button, which will manifest the particles around the area of the material surface. So this is really awesome for, materials that you actually need to do this, that actually need to use the particles with the material surface. So a good example of that in the Alchemy base pack is the cracked earth material, which is like this deserty, cracked, desolate, like bottom of a lake bed or something, earth material, which it's got these like little bits of rocks and stuff on it as a particle system. So it's a really cool example of particle material. But we can press this to update that, or we can press finish painting if we're done. And the other way of painting with particles is that we can, and I'll just go ahead and use this other one, I guess, paint with the particles only. So to do that, we press this button, and we could have done that with that material too. There's no stipulations to it or anything, but so we just press this if we want to paint with just its particles, and then we press paint like that, and paint onto here. And since this particle material is an emitter type, it's gonna send out monkeys and stuff out of that way. So if we press finish painting, because we had paint with particles only, we painted a strip of just those particles to come out of the area instead of the material and its particles. Otherwise, that strip area where we painted down would have been blue because that material was blue. I'm going to go ahead and start up a new file here. And so I want to do, quickly before we go, show an example of a particle material using groups and also multiple particle systems. So let's click on our material tab and make sure we're on this my particle library that we've been building and whatnot, and press library. Okay, so let's make a new one, and let's call this a group. A group Format, which is a very ugly name, but it suffices for now. I'm just going to change it to some random color, pretend like we've got this super awesome material that we spent 3 days making in the node editor and does everything under the sun, instead of just a simple green whatever. So under particle system, if we press new, let's go ahead and switch this to hair type, which we could also use an emitter type that used a group, but I'm just going to do this for whatever reason. Change this default length to something reasonable, like 0.5. And let's go into our backstage layer. That's the layer, that's what I like to think of it as. Let's just make a bunch of junk and group it all together so we can make a group. So like this torus shape, I could go tab into edit mode and alt shift some of these things, and maybe press alt S to do a fat shrink scale thing. Just making something weird. And let's give it a new material. So whatever, dude. Is the name of this material, and it will be green. And pretend it's super fancy and shiny and does weird things is awesome too. We'll go ahead and switch this to material viewport shading. And we can press Shift A and add another object, say a cylinder. And maybe it's got its own material. Cylinder mat, we'll call it. And it's like blue or something. And so we've got these 3 things here, and I'm not going to bother getting that material. I think you get the idea. So we could create a group out of these. So we could just shift select all of them and press Control G, which in Sensei Format, pressing Control G creates a group out of your selection the same way as in Blender default. However, in Sensei Format, when you press Control G, it will also name the group something relevant like a selected object. So this was automatically named cone group instead of just, you know, group 0.00 whatever if it was, you know, Blender default. But of course you can change the name of the group to whatever you want, like, that's fine, actually. And yeah, I'm in the outliner down here. If you're not in Sensei Format, you won't have this go back and view groups thing, but you can just change it manually here from groups to visible layers, which is what it's on by default. Okay, so we got a group here. That's the important thing. So we've got this particle system we added to this object here, and under render, we can change this to group because we're going to be using a group, and select the group we made, which is only one because we only made one, name of cone group. So by default, if you're using a group, it will actually use all of the objects from that group and just kind of scatter them about. But you can keep them, you know, grouped together in the way that you wanted them by clicking whole group here. And now these are properly staying uniform. So they're uniform, but they're not really pointing the direction we want, but we can fix that. So all we need to do is adjust this group until it's doing things that we want it to. So I'm going to shift select this other layer here so that I can see both the group that's making up all the little particles and all the little particles. And then here in Sensei Format in my menu, I'm going to turn on select by group, which is a very nice feature that allows you to, if one object is a part of a group, if you click that, it will automatically select all the objects that are in that group, which effectively makes it like a group of something is one thing you can click on when you need it to be like that. And then I'm going to turn on my transform widget, which is usually on by default in Blender, but you might need to click this thingy, which lets it rotate. You can shift select for multiple of those. Anyway, let's click this and hold Control, and to constrain it, you just rotate this until it's behaving the way that you want it to. And the awesome thing is once you set this thing up, it will treat whatever object you add that material to, the particle material to, the same way. So you're not going to have to do all this setup junk ever again. You just make it look nice once, figure it out, and then you've got a reusable asset whenever you want. You don't have to do all this stuff. So also, these things are sitting very far away from the cube. So I'm going to move them until they're not doing that. And yeah, it has to do with, I guess, the weird thing about this is really, I mean, it's some kind of offset or something, but once we set this up, it will behave properly on every object you apply the material to in the future. So not sure why, but don't really care why either. I just care that it works. Let's get this to where this makes sense. Also, the placement of this gets a little confused when you're using such a rigid shaped object. So for instance, if we were to add a subsurface modifier to this cube, in Sensei Format, we can press W to add subsurface modifier, then tap it some more to increase the levels and also add smoothness. And you can see this is behaving much better now. Another really good setting to keep on for your particle material, just to increase the reusability factor, is use modifier stack. And you can see when we do that the particles go snugly to the object surface. And so as many things as you can set up the first time to make this a reusable asset in the future, you know, good on you for that. So I really don't want to spend too much time getting into how to actually manipulate these particle systems because that's a big can of worms. But you can control the placement a little bit more if you checkmark this advanced option, and then you'll have this physics option open up here, but also there's more options available. This emit from bit shows up when you checkmark that, which is good. And typically I don't like to use jittered. I find this works better when they're emitted randomly. What I mean by that is when you're using particle children, either simple or interpolated. If you use random, typically it seems to be the distribution is overall more even over weird shaped stuff, whereas jittered is not so much. But you can control, you know, do these come out at the points of vertices? Do these come out at the points of faces? What have you. Okay, so I'm going to rename this particle system settings to cone ship, I guess, whatever. But anyway, I said we can use multiple particle systems, which we can. So I'm going to press plus to add another particle system. And yeah, we can go ahead and make this emitter. You can have, you know, hair, emitter. You can have build super crazy particle materials if you want. And we'll make something, click on this other layer over here. We'll make something for this to emit, such as cone shape. And we'll give it a material. So call this cone mat red, because we'll make it red, I guess. But you can pretend it's like a super awesome material that does super cool stuff. And click back on the particle system, click back on the object, and under render, we'll set it to object, this emitter type we're using here. And we'll select that, oh shoot, what was it called? Which cone was it? Let's go ahead and rename it to red cone. And select that. So now if we press play, it's going to shoot out all these red cones. We can add a third one. We'll call it hair stuff and make it of type hair and make it much lower and what have you. And so yeah, you can basically make these as crazy as you want. And you know, I'm not obviously putting detail or a lot of work into this. I'm just wanting to get across to you the mechanics so you understand the potential of what you can do with this stuff. Okay, so if we want to add this to our library, we just go ahead and press plus. We've got this a group par mat in here. So we could close up the library and say we were quitting for the day, and then say we were like coming back and we had some super awesome idea for some crazy thing or whatever. And add a bunch of subsurface to this and apply it. And then so if I were to click on the library we've been working on all this time, we've got that a group par mat. Of course, it's up there now because they're ordered alphabetically when you open up the library. And we could just press use to add that particle material to the object. But what would be funner is to paint some weird stuff on it. So let's give it this my fun material, because you need a base material first before you paint, whether that's with Blender render cycles, Alchemy effect materials, or particle materials. Then let's select this a group par mat. And I'm not going to paint with the surface of the material and its particles because this bottom one's already green. So let's just turn on paint with particles. And then I'm going to press the paintbrush icon and paint where I want this crazy thing. And God, you can already tell this thing's nuts. Look at all this stuff popping up as we paint. It's so ridiculous, but it's awesome, man. There's so much potential in this. Aren't you excited? Go buy this add-on. It's awesome. All right, and then we press finish painting. And so not only does all the groups and hair or whatever particle systems and stuff we made show up on this, but also the emitter particles also follow the areas, they only come out of the areas we painted. So dude, this stuff is really cool. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I know if you're new to particles, then I probably more or less opened a huge can of worms more than gave you a satisfying feeling, because you're like, oh my God, there's so many possibilities, which there are. There's a lot. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you're interested in Alchemy, click on the link over here to learn more about that. You can download the user manual for free, get a better glimpse at what's going on there. Check out the other videos in the Alchemy playlist about the add-on. So I know I'm starting to sound like a bit of a broken record with my one quick thing before we go, but I promise this is really the last thing before this video ends. With Alchemy, you can build your own libraries, create your own particle materials, Alchemy effect materials, and so on. But not only can you do that and then be able to select from that whenever you want, you can also import and export these custom Alchemy libraries. This means after you purchase the add-on, you can actually distribute or share your libraries with other Alchemy users, basically other people who have purchased the add-on. And you can even sell your custom Alchemy material library packs as well. To export the library you made, we can just press System, and under Manage, we've got these Import-Export buttons. So if you want to do, I mean, this is a pretty weird, crappy little library, but because it was just for demonstration purposes. But if you wanted to, you could press Export. As soon as you do, Alchemy was basically looking for a place to put this thing, and I'm just going to put it on the desktop. And that's all you have to do. You don't have to name it or put anything in here. Just press Finish, and you'll get a message, successfully exported the library, My Particle Library. And so this packs up all the assets, everything that this material library consists of, each material's particles or whatever. And so if I would go to my desktop here, here's this my particle library.zip, which you can share with other Alchemy users or sell if you want, or potentially even, promote on my site in the Alchemy forums. And then so if another user if you were to share that with another user or they were to buy it from you or something, all they do is press import and select that zip file and press finish, and that will load in, but I'm not going to do that because, well, we've already got the library here. But you get the basic idea. So that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching and see you next time.